All right. Welcome to the popular music, books, and process series. All events are scheduled for Mondays at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. There's only one more event in the series, though, for this session. Email froyster@depaul.edu to be added to the series email list and get Zoom links. You can watch the video of all the presentations on Eric Weisbard's YouTube channel soon after the event happens. You can find the whole calendar of the series on IASPM US website under the Journal tab. The series is co-organized by Kimberly Mack, Francesca Royster, Gus Stadler, Carl Wilson, and with me sitting in for Eric Weisbard this year. The series is sponsored by the Journal of Popular Music Studies, IASPM US, and the POP Conference. No session next week, but on June 3rd, we'll have Ann Powers talking about traveling on the path of Joni Mitchell. But today we have Robert Dayton in conversation with Carl Wilson on Cold Glitter, the Untold Story of Canadian Glam. Robert Dayton is a multidisciplinary artist and writer. His previous book, The Empty Bed, is a pen and ink book about heartbreak. Dayton tours and performs as Robert Dayton and the Beach Boys and as the Canadian Romantic, where he manifests as videos, a doll, art book, and winking photo. He acted in Male Fantasy. His musical projects include song and dance duo Canned Ham, the conceptual multi-piece July 4th Toilet, acid downer folk group Points Gray, and romantic glam band Hallmark. The Destroyer song Canadian Lover is partly about him. And then we have our very own Carl Wilson. Carl Wilson is the music critic for Slate, and he wrote the acclaimed book, Let's Talk About Love, A Journey to the End of Taste. He is a Toronto-based freelance writer who's also published in book form, Billboard, the New York Times, and many other venues, and spent many years as an editor at alt weeklies and newspapers. Wilson is one of the founding organizers of the popular Music, Books, and Process series, and is currently working on a book about the late poet and songwriter David Berman for W.W. Norton. He recently launched a Substack newsletter called Critic! Place your questions in the chat, and Francesca will lead the Q&A after the conversation, where she will ask you to unmute and ask your questions. Also, use the chats for comments and discussion. And now we'll turn it over to our presenters.
Thanks, Francesca. For those who don't know, it's a holiday. Oh, it was Antonia, sorry. Thank you, Antonia. It's a holiday in Canada today, so it's an appropriate day to be doing this. It's Victoria Day, or as it's more widely known, May 24 weekend. So we're going to start off. Robert's going to present a sort of general ideas and a little excerpt or two from the book, and then we'll move into a conversation. So Robert, why don't you get started?
Sure. Hi, everybody, and thanks so much for having me. Nice to see some of you and all of you, and see some names and all that stuff, names and a few faces. And I'm going to backtrack to where the kernel of this whole Canadian glam idea started. I was living in Vancouver at the time, and there was a magazine out of Chicago called Rocktober that still presents itself every now and then, edited by the great Jake Austin. And one of the, I would contribute to that. And another contributor is Steve Krakow, a writer, artist, musician, and all around wonderful human being. And he was visiting Vancouver. And I hooked up this interview that we were both going to do for his magazine, Galactic Zoo Dossier. And he also goes under the name Plastic Crime Wave. And we were about to interview, this is the show and tell segment, by the way, the Poppy Family. This is my favorite Canadian album. It's not glam, but it's my favorite Canadian album. So we were about to interview two members of the Poppy Family. This is a cherished item in my collection. The late Satwant Singh just died. Susan's no longer with us, but I was able to get their autographs. So we were going to interview them, and Steve Krakow pulled out an album by the Stampeders from Calgary. And he said, I really like these guys. They're kind of like Canadian glam. And that's what got the ball rolling. A few years later, I was living in Kitchener or Kitchener-Waterloo. I guess it's 2 municipalities, but you can walk to them both. And I was going to school at the University of Waterloo. And they said, well, you're a multidisciplinary artist. You've been in all these bands. You do performance. You're interested in all these things. Why don't you do an essay on glam? And I said, well, I'd like to do it on Canadian glam. They went, no, that's a PhD. So I get out of art school, move to Toronto, start work on the book, and continue on the book. Move to LA, where I am at the moment, and still continue on the book. Funny stuff happened March of 2020, and I wound up staying with my brother in a suburb called Surrey, British Columbia. Now, my oldest brother had turned me on to a lot of stuff. And so a lot of the work happened on Canadian glam there. And one of the things that my brother turned me on to when I was a little boy was a band called Sweeney Todd. And when people bring up glam, they think Sweeney Todd. In Canada, I should say. So in here is the third lead singer. That's Bryan Adams. He went on to have a bit of a solo career. There he is. I'd show the front, but it's a little tawdry, so we'll stay away from that. He replaced the lead singer, Nick Gilder. And this is actually, here we go. This is one of the first, this could be one of the early examples of Canadian glam diss tracks. Some say that's supposed to be Bryan Adams, who replaced Nick Gilder. So there we go. So that's exciting. And also there's a song on this album. Oh, no. Called Song for a Star that may be a diss track to Nick Gilder. So that's a bit of the background there. So I want to sort of read a little bit of what I've written to give you a bit more of a background, if that's okay. So this is the heavy intro. What is Canadian glam, they ask, hungry faces all aglow. Is there such a thing? I am so glad that questions such as these are raised. It means that I can answer affirmatively. Nothing entices me more than the nebulous. And what could be more nebulous than the words Canadian and glam? Seemingly contradictory, they rub against each other, causing friction to keep us warm these long winter months. Is it summer right now? I don't know. Perhaps the chill comes from being under the shadow of Canada's powerful neighbor, the USA, plus from being rendered further ineffectual by still having a British monarch on all that Canadian money. For such a vast landmass, second largest, Canada tries so hard to be unassuming. If we think nobody's watching, why be uptight and repressed? Maybe it's the spread. This isolation can sure make you feel lonely. A little glitter on our faces could surely help our problems. Canadian glam provides relevance in my here and now frustration with Canada's perpetually unchanging, culturally conservative climes. Step foot into Canada. Look down. Sun on snow making sparkling glitter. What's that crackling stomp? Look up. It's the Northern Lights. Or just look at Carl's screensaver there. Broad swaths of smeared makeup shimmering across the after-hours sky. Canada, how glam you are. Canada, you sure are glam. Canada is a construct formed out of some very nasty business. Using the word Canadian feels odd in general. So even though this is a history book, it is also an urge to encourage others to create something new, and perhaps a guidebook on how to be more fabulous. Glam was an allergic reaction, bursting out in glitter instead of hives, to shaggy, drippy 1960s rock machismo. It was time to play with identity. Granted, much of this onstage play was done by white guys. However, the importance and influence of Susie Quattro in her black leather catsuit creating heavy stomping belt-alongs should not be underestimated. Still, norms were thwarted and boundaries were stretched. It's okay to be different. Gender play was creaking the door open, working against gender norms and towards turning fantasy into reality. So I go on for a bit about overall glam history here. And here's another segment. In the early 1970s, an article in the Canadian gay magazine, The Body Politic, about the lack of gay music in Canada, reports that RCA Records initially were not going to release what is regarded as a key glam album, Lou Reed's Transformer, in Canada because they didn't see a market for it. That 1973 album, produced by David Bowie and Mick Ronson, is seminal because of the song's subject matter, the camp humor sung in Reed's deadpan style, and the musical arrangements. Even the title, Transformer, is significant, as the lyrics address themes of transformation, including makeup application, gender play, total body changes, and geographical moves to the cosmopolitan big city. And then we get to a bunch more history. How's my time here? How am I doing?
You're doing all right.
I'm doing all right? Oh, great. Okay, I'm going to read a little. I'm going to just brush ahead. Here we go. Where does one draw the implied line? Some Canadian glam acts saw themselves as glam. Some didn't. But they were all wild and even fun, misfits with an abundance of offerings, checking whatever boxes they felt like. It is with plum glee that so much great Canadian glam has been uncovered for inclusion in this book. Some of these artists didn't even play music, making innovation across the spectrum of multidisciplinary art and into magic, comedy, and more. Glam is the most slippery of genres. Knowing that catch-alls are often a quick fix, I hope that we can be flip about it. Now, here's a segment on a band called Twitch. Here we go. From Vancouver, Canada. The Canadian glam rock event to be at was held in 1974 at the legendary Commodore, the infamous big band club with a bouncy castle floor. Curiosity seekers came out, along with a couple of fans in Twitch makeup. Whoever put this bill together was divinely inspired. Not only did Twitch open, but Thor's early bodybuilding band, Michael Body Rock, was also on the bill. The headliners, Z-Wiz Kids, came all the way from Seattle, a 3-hour drive away if the border guards aren't being pricks. Z-Wiz Kids are the connecting thread between the proto-glam pioneers, the Cockettes, and punk, thanks to Tomato DePlenty. Tomato took the legendary, glittery, gender-blending, wild stage shows of San Francisco's Cockettes, of which he was an early member, and put them to good use with Z-Wiz Kids, which he formed soon after moving to Seattle. Describing the heavily theatrical shock value antics of both Twitch and Z-Wiz Kids, Bob Geldof, who was during this period a music journalist for the Georgia Straight newspaper, dismissively described their sets as full of illicit sex, blasphemy, necrophilia, and homosexuality. He also skipped half of Twitch's show, claiming boredom. He wrote, although Twitch and Z-Wiz Kids tried hard, it was fairly obvious that all that glittered was definitely not gold. However, if one were to examine the differentials between the decibel level and the glitter decadence ratio, one would be forced to the conclusion that they were both equally loud and raucous, which, depending on your taste, can be a recommendation or a turnoff. Now, a quick few words about the band Riff Raff, also from Vancouver. Nothing quite says glam like having a hairstylist in your band. Such was the case with Riff Raff. They formed in August 1973, a week or two after a customer named Jim Dick sat down in the stylist's chair at the Vikings, one of the first men's hair salons in Vancouver. This was the spot if you were a man desiring something other than the rigid barbershop haircut. Dick bonded with the hairdresser, Paul Wickett, over their love of glam rock, David Bowie, Lou Reed, and Mott the Hoople. Wickett didn't just cut hair, he also sang and had ambition. The guitarist Jim Dick affirms, the next week he found local Kitsilano lads Jeff Taylor to play drums and Jim Bescott to play bass, and we had a first get-together. Our bass player, Jim Bescott, probably the most creative one in the band, came up with the name Riff Raff. He suffered from bipolar disorder, and when manic came up with all kinds of ideas. One such idea was to put on a History of Rock show. And this History of Rock show culminated with the glam set. We'd all come out in colorful silk and gold lame, as well as some, not a lot, of makeup. Then we would do the David Bowie, Lou Reed, Mott the Hoople stuff, as well as our originals, which Paul and I wrote. So that's a little taste, a little bit. I could show some albums quickly and during, or this is a K-Tel comp. K-Tel is from Winnipeg, Canada. This is all Canadian mint with a lot of glam. Thunder Mug from Ontario, London, Ontario. They were very loud. Flood. This looks like a box of candy. Oh, look at that. He's got a little, yeah. Greg Godovitz has a little teardrop under his eye. The Great Rough Trade. The Tuning Fork, General Idea cover. And Max Webster, High Class and Borrowed Shoes. Justin Page, some may say, is Canada's answer to Jabriath. And there's a lot to this story that I uncovered. Oh, speaking of uncovered, oh my goodness, that holds the record. Robbie Rock's Raw, also from Ontario. Chicken, which came first. They were quite incredible because they had vinyl that was like an egg. Lynx, which were marketed as Canada's answer to Kiss, didn't work out so well. Love Sin. Moving to Quebec, Angelo Finaldi, who recorded a very early glam single over in England for Rack Records and Mickey Most. I love this little expression here. Oh, and then also in Montreal, the great Louis Fury with a full Warhol cover. He worked at Max's Kansas City for a bit. And even in Newfoundland, Shock Absorber. There it is. Peter Francis Quinlan. Okay, that's my show and tell.
Thank you so much, Robert. That's a great taste of the book, which is, really quite vast in scope. And it's a project that I know that you've been working on for years and years. So, I mean, you touched on it a little bit in your introduction, but for you personally, why is the subject of Canadian glam so captivating that you've devoted yourself to digging so deeply in the records? What is it that really grabs you about it?
Well, I had to struggle with the term multidisciplinary for a long, long time. And I went, oh, that's my catch-all term because I do so many things. And why? I don't know. I mean, at a young age, I was really drawn to this glam. Maybe it had its effect on me. Seeing all these wonderful costumes, that makeup, this such a visual element that was musical, and seeing elements of performance and identity play, all of it just fascinating me. And it was just, so I was drawn to it. And I was drawn to it in my own art, in my own music, the music that I made and performed as, my own performance work. It just seemed magical. But not only that, as I said, ineffable. I don't like rigid borders. I just don't. And glam, some might try to say, well, junk shop glam has that, but that's just one type of glam. It's a very open thing. And so, I have all these qualifiers for the book. What qualifies as glam? And do you need all those qualifiers?
Just a quick housekeeping note before I continue. People who've joined us recently, Elena and others, just check to make sure you're muted, because otherwise you may kick into the screen accidentally. Yeah, that's what you were touching on at that last part was one of the things I wanted to talk about, which is there's obviously sort of big taxonomic and definitional questions that run through all of this. And, any book about genre will be like that, but Canadian glam feels particularly so. And, I think that we're familiar with sort of the two poles of glam as the sort of UK early 70s scene, which was fairly well defined as a trend at the time, and that is familiar particularly from Bowie and T-Rex and groups that have had that kind of length of legacy. And then there's kind of American glitter, which is a little more nebulous, and but that kind of theatrical strand of kind of anti-hippie bands like Alice Cooper, and Kiss eventually, And then sort of around the margins, kind of the New York Dolls and a few other things. So the American version standing in contrast in a lot of ways to the UK version. And I wonder where Canada falls in this spectrum, and in the most part. I mean, I know that you've found a lot of varied kinds of acts, but I wonder if you could characterize Canadian
Well,
glam's
it's
general
very,
relation.
the one thing I have noticed, and it is with the New York Dolls, and Canada is a large landmass. You can't really put your finger on one thing and go, that's Canada, because there's just so many, so many regions. And I have divvied the book up into different regions. But in 3 of those regions, the New York Dolls did happen to make it over. And and the New York Dolls even, of course, made it over to England. And there is that cross pollination even between America and England, with Bowie, and hiring a lot of folks like Jane County and Sherry Vanilla to work for Main Man. So the New York Dolls did make it to Canada. They made it to Montreal, they made it to Toronto, and they made it to Vancouver. And a lot of people who went on to punk bands were there, and really, really were divinely inspired. Sweeney Todd opened for the Dolls in Vancouver, and the first time, so they played Montreal twice, and that delightful person, Angie, that I showed up, was playing in a band called Charlie and opened for the Dolls. Or maybe they only played once and didn't get across they had a lot of trouble with the border, Now, but the first time that they played Toronto, it was Rush opening, and that's infamous. Of course, Rush, it was still their first album, so their prog rock element wasn't fully formed yet. But with Canadian glam, there is an element of prog in some of this stuff. I showed that Max Webster album cover, for example, and you see real glammy elements. There's a song on there called Diamonds, Diamonds, and you look at this wonderful, delightful band of costumed freaks. And when I say freaks, I mean it with love, and they look amazing. But there's prog elements in that music. And so and hey, I mean, Bowie had Rick Wakeman play on his albums. Of course, Bowie would later kind of poo-poo glam at times, as would Roxy Music. They would poo-poo that they were glam, mostly because that junk shop stuff was coming out and everyone was doing the sound alikes, so that might be part of it. But that was a strain of romantic glam that I really loved, that Bowie and Roxy did, amongst other, the late Steve Harley, for example. So yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the things that occurred to me when I should say for the audience's information, that I was only able to take a look at the first few chapters of the book because it's still in copy editing. But I got to read the BC section and the Alberta section, and looking at some of the things coming up. One of the things that struck me is that in most contexts, I feel like there's a real separation and often even kind of hostility between the prog and glam scenes in a lot of places. But in Canada, there was really a continuum. There was a lot of mixing.
Now, there was some hostility, especially in Quebec. It seems like Quebec, there's a lot of prog rock lovers, a lot of people who love
Yes.
prog rock. And some of these early bands, what some may say is Quebec's first glam band, Mac, Nick from Mac had to, and the keyboardist, who was American, they both had to find members from prog bands. And they hated prog rock, hated it, but they couldn't find any other musicians. So they had to get them from prog bands. And Aught Chose as well, Lucien Francoeur, who is, a really wonderful, gritty rock and roll poet, hated prog. Vehement. Just hearing him poo-poo prog bands like Harmonium. Yeah.
Right.
So there was a bit of that, but it's
Yeah, but for example, like you have a bit discussing Prism and Trooper, who are not prog, but like identified as kind of post prog stadium rock bands in a lot of ways.
yeah,
But
sort of
pointing out the kind of glam elements that were always there, especially early on with those bands. And that seemed really accurate to me, that it was kind of, I think at one point you say a sort of mutt or a mongrel in Canada comparatively to other places.
Yeah, and glam already feels a bit like a bit of a mutt, which is why I like it. You know, so it gets even more so. It pushes it a little further.
I love the touching on ideas about the Canadian identity and the landscape and isolation and all of these things that you do in the intro. And you have an intriguing bit where you refer to an essay from the Semiotext Canada's issue that talks even about Canada's sort of hidden identity as kind of a queer country in a way. And I wonder how, whether that made Glam a particularly attractive place to focus amid all of the kind of hoser stereotypes of Canada, that this was a whole flip side to that.
Yeah, as sort of you know, there's that essay brings up elements of camp, the camp sensibility, and it's a later essay from the '90s, so it brings up Buddy Cole, Scott Thompson's great character, and so it brings up the elements of camp. And a lot of these bands in this book, yeah, they are very camp. They have that camp sensibility. I mean, you know, I showed Rough Trade, and I think Rough Trade really does qualify as glam, even though their sound is more soulful in a lot of ways. I think they really do qualify because of that camp sense of humor with a lot of those songs. You know, we got, you know, High School Confidential, for example, which, you know, is my gosh, is there even a lyric about, you know, being tongue in cheek? Or, you know, Sweeney Todd, you know, they have a song, you know, about bubble gum on the knees, which is a little outre. Maybe moving to single entendre. So, but you know, but yeah, there is a lot of the camp. You know, the band The Dishes, for example, that came up just after Rough Trade and helped pave the way for punk by doing it themselves. You know, they loved Roxy music, they loved Sparks, and they had very much a camp sensibility. So yeah, it's there, and a lot of these bands, you know, would get chased out of towns. It did happen a lot. So there was, you know, a lot of people that did not react so kindly to what they were doing, unless it was like Thor, who would bend a steel bar with his mouth. But even then, he would have problems because people would try to take him on. So
You mentioned Rough Trade and The Dishes, and it's interesting to me that in Toronto, comparatively to a lot of the scenes that you talk about, there's like a real sort of art school performance art connection that goes on with those bands. And I think a lot of people don't really know the sort of pre-new wave history of Rough Trade and what the kind of art scene that stuff came out of. Maybe you can describe that a little bit.
well, to my understanding, from doing interviews with these bands, including Rough Trade and and members of the Dishes, there was not much going on at that time. We're talking 74, 75. There wasn't a lot going on. And the one venue, and the Dishes really helped pave the way by playing a venue called, I believe it was the Beverly Tavern. And the Beverly was located, you know, I think it's right on or near Queen Street. And that was becoming an art hub, just starting to. And the Dishes were playing the Beverly Tavern, which was very close to the art school. So at first, when they played, no one showed up, and then they started packing the place. And so that art school proximity, including a band called Oh Those Pants, coming out of that art school sensibility as well. So there was that element of performance, and you know, I believe even, gosh, oh, sorry, my brain just escaped. Let me get it back. There was one act I was thinking of, and who, yes, Martha and the Muffins, members of Martha and the Muffins, who came a little later, you know, but had, you know, commonalities and common members with Rough Trade and the Dishes. Martha and the Muffins was a band that had a hit with the song Echo Beach, So for those not in the know, you might know it is very catchy. So, and they were a very synthy band, and members of that went to the art school as well. So
I wonder, given, I think in the UK it's clearer, but I think even in North America there's sort of a clear um, evolutionary line between 70s glam and what became the punk and new wave scenes. And I wonder, you stopped the chronology of the book at 1980, just when those things were starting to come into like full view. So I wonder how you decided about where to fix the chronology and what motivated you at those decisions.
defiance. No, no. It's I even put in the book, I think I say slightly arbitrary. Things I remember, oh my gosh, I remember a bunch of years ago, this is a long time ago, I was out at CITR, the university radio station in Vancouver, British Columbia, and Nardwuar was doing his show, and there was a guy there who was a Beach Boys collector of rare Beach Boys things. This is before the internet, so people would, yes, shout out to CITR. This is before the internet, so this guy had all these Beach Boys rarities, and I remember he was putting these qualifiers, these timelines down, going, well, psychedelic music started at this point and ended at this point, but in Canada it started a little later and ended a little later, and I'm like, why? Can't we make these lines a little fuzzy? So for me, I put 1980 as a good point in time because most of this stuff happened in the 70s, right? And so I go 70 to 80, and I fudged the details a bit, but it's 70 to 80 for the most part. I mean, Rough Trade was active all throughout the mid into the late 70s, but they only recorded, I think, one album in 1975, and they weren't signed and didn't put out their first album until 1980. They didn't get signed until 1980, even though they were incredibly popular. They were on Peter Zowski's late night show. They played the Junos and did High School Confidential, and the Junos is kind of the the shoddy Canadian Grammys, and so they played the Junos, and that's what got them signed. So yeah, so I give
Yeah,
it a
definitely.
little.
Yeah, definitely. There's those sort of lags between what got recognized and what didn't. That raises for me an interest in, looking at the material you've gathered together. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about your research process, because a lot of the bands that I read about for the first time in the BC section of your book don't really have a recorded legacy. Some of them had recorded a few demos, and that was it. With rare exceptions, there aren't a lot of full albums by those bands. And so I wonder how you went about familiarizing yourself with the material and finding archival stuff about them and what to look for, and then finding surviving band members and that kind of thing. Talk a little bit about the journey doing all of that.
Oh, I'd love to say that I just did it all by myself, but actually I wouldn't love to say that. I mean, that's horrible. Who am I? No, I mean, when I started, I didn't think that the book would be this massive, to be honest with you. It seemed like a fun idea. And, there are probably points where where I was deliriously and delightfully in over my head. For British Columbia, for example, there's a great website called Pacific Northwest Bands. And my friend Allison helped me with this as well, because she's neighbors with this one band called Baby Strange. She said, oh, my neighbors were, the one guy was in a band called the Baby Strange, named after the T-Rex song. And they're
I
on
was so
PMBiP.
intrigued by Baby Strange. I really wanted to hear a record.
I know, and they didn't record anything,
Yeah.
so what can you do? But also, meeting all these people, like, and Canada does feel small in some ways. So Sweeney Todd, finding Bud Marr from Sweeney Todd, and then finding out that he was friends with my oldest brother, it's stuff like So there's all that, but there's also just going through record stores. Like, I found out about Thundermug because I went to Audiopile in Vancouver and said, what's this record? They threw it on. I went, this record's perfect. This is amazing. So there's that, and then interviewing these bands, and then them telling me about things like the band Crackers. I'd show their album, but it's a bunch of well, the front cover's a bunch of asses, so I can't show it. But they
Okay.
they they told me about Le Troupe Grotesque. I said, what is that? And then I've said there's barely anything on the internet. And then, sometimes I do internet, help me, help me. Sometimes I know other record collectors, the great Kevin Howes, who did Jamaica to Toronto and also did Native North America, would turn me on to some
Yeah.
things and say, hey, what about this and that? I'd get into arguments with another record collector at work, Ian Marshall, who ran a record store and has done bands that are comedic and performative as well, like Low Down Dirty Dogs. And we'd argue, but he said, what about this? What about that? Is this glam? Is this not glam? So it was all those kind of factors. So
Right.
I'm sure I'm
And
missing something. There's probably more too.
and I assume that when you talk to people, they would point you to further things.
Oh, yeah.
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 How much was there some kind of a network of bands at the time, and how much a lot of the accounts you give, it feels as though a lot of them were kind of quite isolated from each other and didn't really form scenes in the way that we think of it.
Yeah, there is a lot of that isolation. Sometimes they'd have the same booking agent. So in Vancouver, it was Barry Samuels. So Barry Samuels would be the booking agent for Sweeney Todd and Baby Strange and Twitch. And Twitch says that Sweeney Todd and got their makeup from them, their early makeup. They had gobs of gory, almost proto corpse paint type makeup. They were very horrific when Sweeney Todd started, and I could see that they did shows together. And Twitch, of course, played with Thor at the Commodore, as noted. So there was that show. And Twitch, I should say, how did I hear about Twitch? I heard about Twitch because of the record store and record label Supreme Echo. So they've been putting out reissues of Twitch, and Twitch has gone through all these different permutations. So the West, as we know, the West and the East are often really split apart in Canada. They're very, no one really knows what the other side is doing a lot of the time, unless it's like we're talking the art scene, the early art scene, the correspondence art movement, which to me has a lot of glam elements in Canada of the early 70s, with General Idea on one side and the Western Front, along with Dr. Brute, Lady Brute, Anna Banana on the other side, doing the mail art movement, which is sending art through the mail and connecting through File and Anna Banana's Vial. And of course, Anna Banana, in my mind, is, she took identity play to the next level. She became a banana. So yeah, I mean, so they really connected, and even did a mail art ceremony over in Hollywood called the Hollywood Decadence. But for the most part, a lot of these acts didn't connect. I mean, the Dishes and Rough Trade would do shows together. I think there was the bit of that New Beverly scene, but then of course there was the Gasworks scene where bands like Flood and gosh, there's a few others that were more in the rock tip or the power pop tip.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
yeah. So, and I am probably gonna leave out some people. Unfortunately, I feel terrible, that have helped me along on this. So when you say, where'd I get some of this, I'm probably gonna accidentally leave some folks out. So.
Oh, well, you can't be comprehensive off the top of your head here. You have to save that for the acknowledgements page.
It's long. It's long. The acknowledgements say it's a section.
Yeah.
So much help.
There are a couple of things that you've touched on that I wanted to follow up on. One was, when we were looking at that picture of the Stampeders out of Alberta, there was one of them was in sort of costume Indigenous dress, in a kind of Village People kind of way. And, I think there's probably some other instances of that. Were there any actual cases of actual indigenous artists involved in the glam scenes at any of the places you looked at?
Yeah, yeah, this is a bit problematic. I won't deny. You know, and there is some problematic elements, of course. But as for, gosh, you know, they're really, I'm trying to think here because I did really try to look for it, and it was very hard to come by, unfortunately.
Yeah,
There was one band that was misqualified as indigenous and weren't. And so yeah,
right.
it was,
Yeah,
yeah, sadly.
not atypical of the time, and sometimes even now. Um, the other thing I wanted to talk about a little bit was the Quebec scene a bit more, because for those who know, the '70s was an incredibly volatile political time in Quebec, including the FLQ crisis in the early '70s, but also the separation referendums, and it was a really high tension time of language and cultural politics in Quebec. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how that intersected with the glam scene there, and and that kind of thing.
Yeah. So it was, yeah, an intense time in Quebec as glam is happening, and two key bands, Danger, which is, pronounced like, I guess what some would call danger, but it's Danger, and Mac, were two such bands, early glam bands, and their manager definitely had some maybe separatist leanings. I have to be careful with my language here. He definitely was very, very pro Quebec, and he told the bands who had written all of their songs in English, these two bands, and they were primarily, to my knowledge, I believe they were primarily French-speaking bands, but their lyrics were in English. And he said, no, record them in French. So they'd have to do all new French lyrics for the album. So the two albums that came out for Mac and Danger, uh, the lyrics are in French, but they
Right.
originally were not. And he said, well, we'll put them out in English after. So, there are those elements. I mean, Angelo Finaldi, you know, had written who I showed earlier with Angie, had written songs with a group that sprang out of Les Sinners called La Révolution Française. And so there was, these very, very pro Quebec type songs that he'd written. And one song that he'd co-written, even uses the term Pepsi in the title. And
Right.
so,
Right.
yeah, which is,
Which for,
that's,
yeah, for Americans, explain the significance there.
it is used as, I guess, that song I think might be a bit of a reclamation because it's
Yeah.
used as a bit of a slur, and it's also poverty shaming in terms of the French people in Quebec, and it's used against them. And it was
Yeah,
predominantly,
Anglophones would call Francophones Pepsis as if they were,
yeah.
the inferior second class drink. Um, and it's interesting too when you were talking about the prog and glam scenes clashing in Quebec too, because it's I think of it too. It's that glam is a very Anglophilic genre overall. It's very heavily British identified, and a lot of those Quebec prog bands um, were very nationalist. There was a lot of promotion of Quebec culture and bands like Harmonium, and there was a lot of crossover between those bands and the sort of chanson scene at the time. And so it's interesting to think of glam as being like kind of an outlier in that moment.
Yeah,
Um,
the Eurocentric elements, yeah.
well, I know that we're gonna go to Q&A fairly soon. So people out there should think of questions while we're talking about this last couple of things. But there's two last things I want to ask you. One is that you have a section in the book um, that covers non-music glam phenomena in Canada, in performance and film and comedy and magic. And I'd love if you just told people a little bit about those parts of the book.
Oh, for sure. I mean, when I talk about these glam qualifiers, I see it happening in comedy with La Troupe Grotesque, as a comedy duo that was pretty groundbreaking in Canada. And, they started in the late 60s. Their story is absolutely intense and incredible. It has run, that chapter had basically come out of a website called By NWR. Jimmy McDonough was the editor, and Kayla Janice was the guest editor, and said, this qualifies for what I'm doing. And so I wrote this. I found out more and more and more. Lynn Johnson's comic strip, For Better or For Worse, the first gay character in a newspaper strip, was based on one member of La Troupe Grotesque, Michael Boncoeur. And so they were a duo. They started in the late 60s in Vancouver, where they knew Lynn Johnson, went to high school with her. They opened for the Velvet Underground on their second album tour when they were really noisy, their second album show in Vancouver. They wound up moving over to, Hamilton, writing for the hilarious House of Frightenstein TV show, which is, if glam rock was a comedic show about monsters. So
yes, exactly.
a lot of makeup, a lot of stuff. And they left Troupe Grotesque would dress up in these elaborate costumes. And then we have Magic, we have Doug Henning. And Doug Henning, to me, really pushed glam in his Magic, and pushed Magic forward by he dressed very glammy, the satin, colorful pants. And he really, made it all about imagination and bigger than life, which to me, glam, I mean, Magic is already visual, but he was also open to collaborating with bands, and even early on collaborated with David Cronenberg. So yeah.
Yeah, he was an extraordinary figure that anybody around our age remembers from childhood, and this really kind of inescapable Canadian cultural presence, and went on to, run for parliament under a Transcendental Meditation Party banner. And yeah,
That's when he
just
really got into
incredible
pastels.
story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's really into pastels then, but he moved away from the whole tux and tails, old school kind
Yeah.
of, rigid, machismo Magic. So.
Yeah. And finally, before we go to Q&A, just one more question. And, people might have more to say about this in the Q&A, but what would you say is the legacy of Canadian glam? Were all these things that's sort of flowered and then died and were forgotten, or has that lineage been carried on in Canadian culture? And who could you point to that people might be familiar with that you think are representatives of that tradition?
Yeah, that's a tricky one, isn't it? Because like I gave that 1980 cutoff as a rough thing, but then there's just, I remember, I brought up, we brought up Dan Behar earlier. And he was one of my sounding boards when I was writing the book, and he has a band called Destroyer. And we were talking about Rough Trade, and Dan said, Rough Trade is going to really be seen as one of the all important bands that have influenced so many people. Who they've influenced, I'm not fully sure. So I'm guessing you're asking who would be around in the last bunch of years that would have elements of glam in them. Is that
Yeah,
kind of
sure.
what you mean?
Yeah.
So I mean, yeah, it's hard. Well, I mean, the one that everyone loves to bring up is Peaches, of course. Peaches has the humor, the gender play, the performance, the costumes, all of that stuff is going on, but pushing it more modern. Even Slim Twig, which is again an arch persona, and really made a glam album with a hand tinted photo, but really also pushed it further into the future with modern hip hop techniques, production techniques in the music, but still making it very glammy. And even this name Slim Twig is a very arch name. So these personas as well seem to be very glammy. So those are two I can think of right offhand. So
yeah. I mean, definitely, I think, early Destroyer, you certainly hear the influence of Roxy Music and that kind of era of sound, of UK sounds, and their
and consistently changing his sound, was doing a whole album that's all MIDI, or and of course those early albums he'd do a little, he'd go a little rock, he'd make a little rock, a very T-Rex thing to do. And yeah, so
and yeah,
and
with
Bowie
Peaches,
was listening.
and with Peaches, and that, I think of that era where Peaches and Chili Gonzalez and Feist were all in Berlin, like doing sexual puppet shows and, really kind of campy performance art stuff as they were developing their musical acts and everything. And so they all seem to have kind of glam roots in that way.
For sure. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Robert. And I'm
Thank
going to
you.
turn us over to Francesca now so that she can get questions from the audience.
That was fascinating. Thank you so much. Thanks, Robert. And thank you, Carl. Okay, our first question is actually from Antonia, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, thank you so much for this presentation. And this actually picks up with what Carl just asked about how Canadian glam lives on today, if at all. I was thinking about Rufus Wainwright as an inheritor of glam, thinking about the queer content of Rufus. Rufus is his songs, but also his campness and his grandiosity, and also his he's more butch these days, but he used to be real pretty and femme, earlier on in his career. So thinking about him as an inheritor of glam.
Oh, yeah. No, I've never actually thought of him as an inherited glam, but that can make sense. I'm going to have to do a deep dive.
That's terrific. Well, the next question was mine, and we've kind of gotten to it, but I did have another question that I was trying to figure out how to articulate, which is, how would you say Canadian glam kind of maps onto or doesn't LGBTQ movements in Canada? Because I was just thinking about glam here and the way, how slippery identity is if we're thinking about like Bowie or others. And yeah, just wondering your thoughts on that.
And it is slippery, and of course I can't speak for these acts, and and it does go all across the board. I mean, even yesterday, chatting with a couple folks, the term gender play, for example, I'm going, well, I sometimes I have to defer. I'm going, is that a good phrase? Is it okay to use? And then I think about gender play, and I think that it, we're, there's people who are playing with gender because it's a construct, and then there's people who are doing the gender play who are really, who are way over on the other side of that too. And, and Alice Cooper is one that comes to mind. I although not Canadian, his producer at one point was, but, comes to mind where it's like, well, is he doing any sort of gender play? And some of his statements lately have not been so good. So, so yeah, there is a wide range. One band that I have interviewed, really specified saying that we are not a gay band, but most of the members in the band are gay. So that's, that was what they would say. But there was one of the members who I interviewed said that. So, however, there were elements, of camp and all that, and a little bit of gender play, not so much in terms of makeup, but with that particular band, trying to also elaborate there. So there were definitely those elements, and the one place that I really found fascinating is that a lot of people would tell me that there were no glam hangouts in Vancouver, British Columbia. And that's wrong. There was a bar called Faces, and Faces was incredible. It was essentially a gay bar. And Faces played a lot of soul, and also a lot of glam. And out of Faces was an act called the Facettes, because the one manager of the Facettes, Dennis Robbins, had seen the Cockettes. We're talking West Coast here, so Vancouver to San Francisco. It's easier to get to San Francisco from Vancouver than it is to Toronto. So, had known, it's met and seen the Cockettes. So the Facettes was kind of a nice tribute in Faces. And when Lou Reed came to town, as a result of Transformer being released in Canada, you know, when Lou Reed came to town, the Facettes dressed up as cheerleaders. And, you know, one of the nice things about Canada is, you know, with a lot of this glam is some of the folks are still hairy. So they dressed up in cheerleader garb, but there were still some mustaches with the makeup, which I love, which is a very, you know, did I say coquettes? That's what I mean, a coquettes thing. Oh, yeah. So, yes.
That's
Yeah,
a
you know,
great look.
sorry, go ahead, Francesca.
No, I just said it was a great look. Go ahead, Carl.
I mean, it's interesting to ask the question of how these things mapped onto what was happening in movements, because like there's all kinds of versions, as you were saying, Robert. You know, there's the side of glam that I think Sweeney Todd would sort of represent to a degree, to what was going to evolve into hair metal in the 80s, which was sometimes called glam metal, but definitely with Rough Trade and the Clichettes and other Toronto acts specifically that I'm aware of from that area. They're, you know, these were queer activists and they were doing queer performance art. And so some of it was really, really keyed in to gay liberation movements. And some of it, you know, only connected in the sense that they would get called names and people might try to beat them up.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the whole body politic trial, you know, I interviewed Larice, and Larice had come over from England and had done some very early glam songs. And then Larice went disco in Montreal. And so there's that connection between glam and disco. So it was glam disco. And then Larice came over to Toronto and Larice said, oh yeah, I was at the body politic trials. So yeah, so there is these strong connections. So yeah, and Justin Page, you know, when I say Canada's answer to Jabriath, well, I interview, you know, Justin Page did not want to be interviewed. I couldn't necessarily find Justin Page, but I could find the man who wrote all of Justin's songs, Joey Miller, who came from a strong musical theater background. And, you know, when I met Joey basically said right off the bat, like, well, Justin wasn't gay, but, you know, but Joey wrote all these songs that had, because Joey was gay, a lot of these references. So, you know, they would dress really wild, the whole band, including Joey, was the keyboardist on stage. And then there'd be references to places like the Parkside, which was not gay run, but it was a gay bar in Toronto, and that faced some serious, there was some serious homophobia going on there. You know, so there is that tie-in with that history for sure. Yeah.
That's really fascinating. Thank you. And thanks to both of you. Jason, you have a question for us if you'd like to unmute.
Sure, thanks. Great topic. Really enjoyed it. I wanted to ask what you've learned about audiences and fandom, and you got at this a little bit in talking about a glam hangout in Vancouver. But I'm thinking too about the context of live performance once you got outside of the major urban centers. You mentioned that sometimes the bands would get run out of town. So thinking about, is there a similar kind of tension like you saw in punk live performance where the spectacle elicits hostility on the one hand, but also awe and wonder for other viewers and listeners? Did you get any sense of that?
Awe and wonder, absolutely, but not in every town, of course. But sometimes they'd win them over. When I interviewed Kevin Staples of Rough Trade, Kevin basically said that they could not have really existed much outside of Toronto, because Toronto was a very cosmopolitan city. And so sometimes playing these outlying areas, it's a little tougher. But when I talk about a band like The Nerve who are in Saskatchewan, which is farm country, The Nerve, I said, was there any problems? They said sometimes, but for the most part, some of the folks were, you know, just wanting a show. People in Humboldt, Saskatchewan, just wanting a show. And so, you know, it's not always so cut and dry. You know, I've been to the mall in Humboldt. I've been to Humboldt plenty, and it's a small town in Saskatchewan. And, you know, I go to the mall, go to the record store in the 80s, and the guy's selling Cramps bootlegs. So, hey, what do you know? But, you know, some of the crowds, like the Stampeders crowds and stuff, might be a little younger. Sometimes they would dress up a little bit here and there for, say, Twitch or they'd wear the t-shirts. So there would be a little bit of that, but yeah, so it did kind of run the gamut. Does that make sense? Or answer your question?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was looking for.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you.
Just thinking just the pleasure of all the names, the group names,
Right.
so fun. That in and of itself, I think is seems to be a joyful part of the project to be able to kind of engage. Let's see, well, if we don't have any other questions, maybe we will go ahead and wrap up for tonight, or today, depending on where you are. Thank you so much to Robert and to Carl for this amazing conversation, and I can't wait for the book too. And thanking everyone for coming. Also, and to remind you that we will not be meeting at our usual bat time on Monday, 5 o'clock next week, but on June 3rd, we'll be hearing from Ann Powers, who will be talking about traveling on the path with Joni Mitchell at 5 o'clock Eastern time. So please come join us. And thanks again. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. I'd be remiss if I didn't say this. A little bit of promo hype. The book is coming out by Feral House, great publisher, Feral House, and there is a pre-order campaign coming soon with all sorts of knickknacks and gewgaws that come along with it. So
I love knickknacks and geegaws.
be on the
Excellent.
lookout for that.